Welcome to Good Spirit Graphics. In this tutorial, we're going to be working with Mocha data in Blender's Compositor. We'll be working in this part of MochaBlend's panel. We'll cover creating mask output nodes and also 3D output nodes. We're going to be using this rotoscoped car from an earlier tutorial. You can see we have the car, the headlights, and the two front grills rotoscoped. So let's go ahead and first export the tracking data. That's to get the format that's missing from the Nuke RotoPaint export. So let's copy to clipboard and go to Blender. Then let's paste this in. And you can see our Blender settings are not set yet, so let's go ahead and import that format. Then let's go back to Mocha and get our shapes. Now let's export our shapes. We're going to select all visible layers because we want to get the grills, the headlights, and the car. Let's copy to clipboard. Now let's paste this in. Now we have our 5 splines, that's correct. And let's drop our footage in here into the movie clip editor. Let's go down to clip, set our scene frames. That will set our render settings basically to the size of the footage. And let's go ahead and create that mask. There we go. You see we have our 5 shapes here. And if we scroll through the timeline down here, you'll see they imported perfectly. I'm going to go ahead and move MochaBlend up. Sometimes when you create masks, new panels pop up, and you need to reorganize things a little bit if you want to keep MochaBlend at the top. Now let's take a look at what our masks are going to look like in the Compositor. We'll go to Mask Display, and we'll also click on Combined. So if we scrub through the timeline, you'll see this is what we're going to get in the Compositor. Now if you want to render this out, MochaBlend makes it very easy for you. All you need to do is click on Mask Output Nodes, and that will set everything up for export in the Compositor. It will take your current footage, your current mask, which contains your layers here, and sets things up for you in the Compositor. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you what will happen. If we click over to Compositing, you'll see Use Nodes is not checked. That doesn't really matter. MochaBlend will set that up for you. And if we go ahead and click it, you'll see by default you get a Render Layers node and a Composite node. This is the output. This is what is going to get rendered out when you press Render Animation. Now we don't need the default setup because MochaBlend will set that up for you. And the Render Layers node is used for outputting from a camera in the 3D view. So since both of these are selected, I'm going to click on Delete, get rid of that, and go back to the movie clip editor layout. Now I want to show you how it's going to work when you press on this button. So let's go ahead and split this window instead of switching back and forth between the Compositor. Let's click on Node Editor. Make sure we're on Compositing Nodes here. And Use Nodes is already checked because I checked it a second ago. So let's go ahead and click on this now. Mask Output Nodes. You'll see we get a node tree set up. I'm going to click on Control Up arrow so you can see the node layout better. And if we click on Backdrop, we'll see the output of this node tree. Now if you want to zoom the image here a little bit, you can either hit Alt-V to zoom in, V to zoom out, or you can go ahead and drag this slider on the right panel. Now if you want to change the background color, we can adjust it here to anything we want. And if you want to put an image in the background, you can just drag an image from a folder, drop it in here, and an image node will pop up. We'll go ahead and take this input here and click it as a backdrop. This is what we're going to render out if we click on Render Animation. Now, MochaBlend also sets you up with a Dilate and Erode node. And I want to show you what that's going to do right after we zoom in a little bit more. I want to show you that this is not a high-resolution image, but by default our mask is not anti-aliased. So if we click on anti-alias, you'll see it will clean it up a little bit. Now Dilate and Erode does just what it says. It makes your mask bigger or smaller. And it gives you a couple ways to do that. One using a step factor, and another is using a feather. You get very different results depending on which one you choose. I'm going to click this back to 0 here. MochaBlend also sets you up with a blur node. So if you want to add a Gaussian blur or some other blur to your image, actually it's not to the image, it's to the mask, then you can use this node. If you don't want to use these, you can just bypass them, go straight into the mix node, and not use those nodes. We also get the option of clicking on motion blur here, setting a shutter value, and getting some motion blur here, which you can see over the sky. I'm going to disconnect this image so we can see it a little bit better here. You can adjust the samples to get a higher and lower quality blur. I'll double it to 32. And let's see, let's move this up to the maximum of 1. And you can see we're getting a lot of motion blur here now. Now if we just want to affect the color of our car here, we can go ahead and switch this to the other input. Let's go ahead and change this to multiply. And also let's turn off our motion blur for the moment. We'll set this to 0. And you can see we can now adjust the hue of our car to whatever we want. Kind of desaturate it a little bit like that. Now if we just want to isolate the car with a transparent background, we're better off with an alpha over node instead of this mix node. So let's go ahead and create one here. We can either click on Shift A, or we can open up the little panel over here and go down to color and click on alpha over. Now let's go ahead and switch these inputs over to here. I'll put this one on the bottom and connect up our viewer and our output. Now let's go ahead and lower our alpha channel to 0, and you can see we've effectively isolated our car. Now if you prefer to work with an alpha over most of the time instead of the mix node, MochaBlend gives you that option in the user settings. Let's go to File, User Preferences, Add-ons, pull up the MochaBlend add-on, and under the user settings, you can select Default Output Blend Node as Alpha Over. So let's go ahead and save that. Exit out of here. Now if we exit full screen by either hitting Control Up arrow or clicking on Back to Previous, we can go ahead and create another node layout here, Mask Output Nodes, and you'll see this time MochaBlend has given us a default alpha over node here. So whichever one you work with the most, go ahead and set that in the user settings. Click on Viewer. We need to go back into here, reset our alpha channel back to 0, and we have our car isolated. Now, what if you have two composite nodes in your scene? How is Blender going to know which one to output when you click on Render Animation? Well, it's going to be the one that is selected. So you can have several node trees set up simultaneously and pick the one you want to output just by clicking on the composite node connected to the tree that you want. Now, if you want to render this out, let's get out of full screen mode here. Let's switch over to the compositing layout. Let's zoom out a little bit, make sure we're selecting the correct output. Yes, we want this one here. Let's click on Anti-Alias. And on our output settings, let's go ahead and set it up for the output location we want. And also we want transparency, so I'm going to export a PNG sequence with RGB alpha and click on Render Animation. Okay, we only have 24 images, so that was pretty fast. Now, we don't see transparency here in our rendered output. That's because you have to turn on transparency for the view that you're looking at. There you go, that's what we outputted. And the same for the backdrop. If you want to see transparency here, you have to make sure you've selected the correct output channels to see. I showed you earlier how MochaBlend can create masks from Mocha shapes not only in the movie clip editor, but also in Blender's 3D view. By pressing this button, MochaBlend can set up some nodes in the Compositor to render those masks out of the 3D view more easily. First, let's create these mask layers in the 3D view. I'm going to go ahead and split the window just so you can see them pop up. Turn this into the 3D view here and close down the tool panel. Now let's create a 2D camera first by pressing this button, and then go ahead, select Textured, and create Shape Mask. Now we'll zoom in a little bit here, and you'll see we have created all our shapes in the 3D view as animated splines. Now let's switch this view over to the node editor, and press this button here, 3D Output Nodes. Now if we zoom out a little bit, somewhere in here we have some output nodes. If you don't see them, go ahead and press Compositing Nodes here, so we have the correct setting for the compositor. And let's go ahead and look at these full screen. I'll press Control up arrow, and you'll see we have a node layout similar to before. But this time our input comes from a Render Layers node. That's going to take the image from the camera in our 3D view. It's going to pass it on to a vector blur node, which will give us real 3D vectors to do motion blur. We have a dilate and erode node and a blur node, like the previous setup, and we have our default alpha over to combine our original footage with this mask. Now let's go ahead and select this viewer, click on Backdrop, and press F12 to render the current frame. Now I did that to show you that if you don't have things set correctly in Blender's render settings, Blender will change your window to a viewer to show you your rendered image. If you don't want that to happen, let's go ahead and click on Back to Previous. Let's go to our default setup, and in our render settings here, Display in Image Editor, that's why it stole our window. Let's go ahead and select Keep UI. There we go. Now this time let's switch over to the compositing layout, and you'll see here our rendered image. Now I'm going to press Home to zoom into our node tree. Now this time the blur on the edge of the mask is coming from this vector blur node, which is taking speed vectors from the Render Layers node, which in turn is taking them from the camera in our 3D view. So as our shape moves in 3D space, we actually get 3D speed vectors which we can use to blur not only the edge of our mask, but actually the part of our image isolated by our mask. I'll show you how to do that now. Let's go ahead and select our vector blur node. I'm going to press Shift D to make a copy of it. Now let's go ahead and connect up our Z input, which is our depth channel, and our speed input, which is our vector information. Now let's move it to the other side of our alpha over here and connect the image input here and our output here. We'll duplicate our viewer here and use that to put the image on our backdrop. Now let's go to a frame where we have a lot of motion. First I'll press Home, hovering over our timeline to expand it to our current render settings. Let's go to frame 13. I think the car is moving a lot on that frame. And I'll press F12 to render. Now you'll see the interior part of our image is blurred, and we can adjust that by using this vector node. Now instead of a black background, let's take the original image and put that in as the background. And you'll see we have independent control now of the motion blur on the car, which is real motion blur coming from the movement of our spline in 3D space. The last thing I'm going to show you is the ID mask node. Let's go ahead and hook up an output viewer to that. Take a look at what it's doing. We get individual access to the splines in our 3D view with this node. We can select the headlights, the grills, or whatever we have rotoscoped from Mocha. If we select the main car, which is this large spline here, we'll get the main mask with the other items mathematically subtracted from it. Now let me show you how this works. When MochaBlend created your shapes down here, it did a few things to make your life easier. The first thing it did is if we switch over to the Render Layers tab, you'll see it created a render layer called MochaBlend Masks. All of your shapes are on this render layer. Also, each shape, if we go to the Object Properties, was assigned a pass index. This value here is what you're selecting here. So if we select, for example, the left headlight, you'll see it has a pass index of 4. If you select 4 on the ID mask node, you will get that headlight. This system makes it easy to access individual splines from your Mocha export.